A millionaire gave $450 to a beggar to buy food for her child. The next morning, he saw her at the grave of his beloved who died 23 years ago. Richard Lawson sat in one of New York City's most elegant restaurants, yet the extravagance all around him seemed pointless. There was an emptiness inside of him that nothing could fill. He noticed drops of rain dropping like tears down the glass as he stared out of the window, representing the weight of his heart. The rain was falling steadily onto the streets. The bleak and dark outside world perfectly mirrored his mood. Always rainy, gloomy, and deserted. Things had stayed that way for over 2 decades, ever since his wife Emily passed away. Sadly, Richard could not bring himself to let go. She had a gap in her life that neither success nor money could ever fill. Even though he had built a financial empire, his victories didn't seem so great. Going through the motions, he attended formal lunches and business meetings. All of this, though, was just a diversion from the daily pain he endured. Raising his glass of wine and idly swirling it around, Richard dreamed about lavish parties, formal dinners, and business negotiations. Everything tasted bland to him. All of it was moot now. With a sigh, he expressed how much the years were weighing on him. Actually, despite everything that he has accomplished, Richard was by himself. He was unaware that he was a father. Emily had never wanted to discuss having children before she passed away, and Richard had not made her feel compelled to. He truly hates it now as he thinks back on it, since there was a part of Emily that he would sacrifice anything for someone to love and look after. Richard picked up his wool coat and walked up after paying the bill. It felt like everything was happening in another dimension, so even though the restaurant was full of people talking and laughing, he was unable to hear anything. He stepped outdoors into the wet sidewalk, where freezing rain was still falling heavily. Even with the city bustling around him, Richard was aware of his isolation and the cold rain. On his way home, he passed all the places he and Emily used to visit. Every building looked like it belonged to a time when things had been so much simpler and happier. But now there were just ghosts and a headstone. Tomorrow, like most days, he would visit Emily's grave. Richard was never entirely sure why she had chosen New York over Père Lachaise in Paris, where her natural resting place would have been. Maybe that was because the city represented the life they had started together, a life they lost much too soon. As he walked along the rain-soaked pavement, something caught his eye. A young mother with a baby in her arms was hunched over behind the awning of a store. Her hair was damp from the rain, making her look even more fragile. The sight deeply stirred something in Richard. He hesitated, not sure what to do. He was not the type to become involved in these kinds of things. He'd made countless donations to charities over the years, but he wasn't accustomed to dealing with the underprivileged face-to-face. Nevertheless, something about this girl made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way she held the infant, gently and lovingly, that reminded him of someone or something. Richard approached cautiously, the rain pouring down his coat. He said this while withdrawing $350 in cash. He had just withdrawn cash from an ATM. He handed it on to her. "Use this to get meals for both you and your baby." The woman glanced at him, her eyes widening with surprise, before turning immensely thankful. "Thank you. I truly appreciate it," she said as she shuddered. For a little while only. Richard felt a stirring inside. There was something reciprocal about this stranger, like their pain. Without further word, he just nodded and turned to go. But as he strolled down the street, he couldn't help but think about what he had just witnessed. He had the impression that something he had forgotten about himself had come back to life. As he got to his residence, Richard was exhausted, both mentally and physically. The sound of the rain pattering against the glass was his only companionship as he lay in bed. He closed his eyes, but his mind kept replaying the image of the mother holding her child. Tomorrow was going to be just like any other visit to Emily's grave, but little did he know that this routine visit was going to alter his life forever. The morning after, Richard carried on with his routine. He rose early, dressed in his usual fitting suit, and headed to Emily's cemetery. The rain that had saturated the city the night before had left it still damp, and the gloomy sky outside his window aptly summed up how he felt. He grabbed his coat and headed out into the familiar wait, settling into his chest in preparation for yet another somber visit to the cemetery. As he made his way to the cemetery, Richard's mind went back to the girl and her baby. He had no idea why the image of them kept returning to him. Over the years, he had seen a lot of desperate people, but something about that encounter had stuck with him. The desperation in the young woman's eyes belied a deeper message that he was unable to exactly place. It unnerved him. Arriving at the cemetery, Richard took the well-trod route in the direction of Emily's burial. The only sounds were the wind rustling the trees and the distant city hum. This was a place he knew too well. However, this day was not like the others. He would stand in front of her gravestone, talk to her as if she were still there, and then leave feeling as empty-handed as he had been since the day she passed away. This was how every visit went. As he approached the tomb, Richard happened to notice something strange. I looked around and saw someone kneeling in front of Emily's tombstone. His heart skipped a beat. It was that same young woman from the night before, holding her baby in her arms. She collapsed over her shoulders, shaking as if she were crying. Richard stood motionless, his mind racing. What had brought her here? How in the world could she know who Emily was? The coincidence was too unexpected, too scary, and as he walked slowly toward her, he felt a wave of confusion and anxiety sweep over him. "Please, pardon me," Richard spoke in a low, uncertain voice. Glancing up, the bloated and red-eyed woman quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her old jacket. I apologized as she stammered and tried to gather herself. "It was not my intention to annoy you." Richard shook his head, still trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. "You were here yesterday," he replied, "idly outside the restaurant. I gave you money as a gift." The mother nodded, her gaze resting on the baby she was carrying, as if their relationship was enough to justify everything. But Richard didn't have to understand what was happening. Why was this woman, a stranger, going to the grave of his wife? "Why are you here?" With more firmness, Richard asked, "Now, how do you know?" "Emily." The woman seemed to be pondering whether or not to answer for a short while. She inhaled deeply and looked up at him, her eyes full of a strange mix of agony and resolve. "Emily." Richard felt the floor rock slightly beneath him, his breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he thought he misheard her when she continued, "She's my mother." He glanced at the woman in disbelief, his mind trying to make sense of what she had just said. "Your mother." Once more, his voice was hardly heard above a whisper. "That is not practical." "Emily. She never had children." The woman shook her head in an unintelligible way. "She did," she said quietly. "She had me. She just never told you about it." It seemed to Richard that time had stood still. His mind raced, attempting to piece together her words, but nothing seemed to make sense. Emily was never going to be a mother. She would have told him if she hadn't kept something like that a secret from him. The knowledge hit him like a ton of bricks, and he recoiled. "No," he said, not to her but to himself. "That is not achievable. I understand that this is challenging to believe." "It's the truth," the woman said in a steady, calm voice. "My mother's name was Emily, and my name is Sophie." Richard felt his heart tighten as she began to realize how true her comment was. He looked at the woman, Sophie, and then the baby in her arms. His head was full of questions, but he didn't know where to begin. How had this happened? How could he not have known? Why hadn't she informed me? With a cracked voice, he asked, "Why wouldn't she tell me this information?" Sophie looked at the ground, her expression mournful. She stated she wasn't sure. She was a person I had never met. She died before I ever got to know her. I was raised by a different family. Richard's heart pounded violently within him. He had been grieving his wife's loss for over 20 years, and he thought he knew everything there was to know about her. And suddenly, he had to think about the possibility that she had been hiding something so significant. The secret she had been keeping for so long caused everything to alter. His head spinning, he took a deep breath. "Why now?" he muttered, shaking his head. "I don't understand." "Why have you come here?" For the first time, Richard noticed anything as Sophie's eyes met his. A faint Emily flavor. "I've been trying to piece together the reality ever since I found out where she was buried," she added. "A few months ago, I found out about her. I was obliged to travel." Looking at her, Richard was still unsure of how to process everything. His emotions were a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and fury. But below it all was a ray of optimism, a hope that maybe this connection with Emily wasn't over. He glanced down at the baby in Sophie's arms, and something inside him shifted. Providing Sophie was telling the truth. If Emily had been her mother after all, this child was his grandchild, a piece of Emily alive for the first time in years. Richard sensed something more than grief. He didn't know what to say, but one thing was certain. He'd experienced something he never would have imagined. Richard staring at Sophie, his head still reeling from what she had just revealed. When the wind kicked up a little and began to rustle the leaves around the graveyard, all he could hear was his heart pounding in his ears. The baby in Sophie's arms stirred and whimpered softly, and that little sound seemed to jolt him out of his dream. "How is that even possible?" Richard asked in a scarcely audible voice. His thoughts were racing with questions. It was as if Emily's memory had failed him, as if the woman he had been mourning for almost 20 years had been someone else. He did not know for sure, but he did know one thing. Sophie accepted her statements as true. "I realize it's a lot to take in."
Sophie's voice was kind but firm.
"To be completely honest with you, I have spent my entire life trying to comprehend. Emily was the name of my mother." Richard felt his heart tighten. "Why didn't she let me know?" he nearly muttered to himself. It was unbearable to think Emily had kept something vital from him. For so many restless nights, he had wondered what they may have shared. If only things had gone differently. Now, those what-ifs seemed to carry an entirely different, painful meaning. Sophie gave a gentle shake of her head, sympathy gleaming in her eyes. "I'm not sure why she chose not to tell you about it. I never got the chance to ask her. She passed away while I was still a fetus." Richard tried to focus, but his mind was racing. "There must be more to the story. Someone mentioned you. If Emily was your mother, then why did I not know about you?" Sophie shuffled nervously, looking down at the floor as if the information was too much to take in. "After her death, I was turned over to another household. I was not aware of my biological parents when I was growing up. Up until recently, all I had was a name and some vague information that I could piece together. I didn't know where to start looking for you." Richard had heart pain up until a few months prior. He had assumed all his life that he knew everything there was to know about Emily, so he was taken aback to discover that there were more dimensions to her life. "You came here for clarification because he hadn't even read." Sophie nodded. "Yes, in fact, I wanted to know who she was. I wanted to know why Mom had kept me in the dark and when I would find out where she was buried. I knew I had to come." Richard's gaze fell onto the tombstone, displaying his late wife's name etched in a stern, icy stone. He'd visited Emily's grave regularly for so long, had conversations with her, and tried to accept her loss. But that calm felt broken now that Sophie and the baby were here, and everything about him changed, including his memories, his understanding of Emily, and his anguish. He took a deep breath as his mind searched in vain for something solid to cling to throughout this storm of emotions surrounding the kid. Pointing to the child in Sophie's arms, Richard mumbled, "Is this my granddaughter?" his voice trembling a little. Sophie turned to look at the baby and smiled gently, calming herself down. "Yes," she whispered softly. "His name is Daniel." Richard stared at the baby, who looked tiny and fragile. His heart pounded with a combination of surprise, confusion, and something else he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope Daniel acted as a conduit between Emily and the life they may have had together, a life that had been concealed from him for a while, but that he could now embrace. Everything threatened to overwhelm Richard, and he felt its weight. He had spent years mourning Emily's lost existence and living in the past. From this position, he saw that life had not completely disappeared. He was being given the chance to reclaim a little of what had quietly continued without him. Still, there was betrayal. How could Emily have kept this from him? How in the world could she have made such a significant decision and told him she was pregnant? I've been trying to piece together the reality ever since I found out where she was buried, she added. A few months ago, I found out about her. I was obliged to travel. Looking at her, Richard was still unsure of how to process everything. His emotions were a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and fury. But below it all was a ray of optimism, a hope that maybe this connection with Emily wasn't over. He glanced down at the baby in Sophie's arms, and something inside him shifted. Providing Sophie was telling the truth. If Emily had been her mother after all, this child was his grandchild, a piece of Emily alive for the first time in years. Richard sensed something more than grief. He didn't know what to say, but one thing was certain. He'd experienced something he never would have imagined. Richard staring at Sophie, his head still reeling from what she had just revealed. When the wind kicked up a little and began to rustle the leaves around the graveyard, all he could hear was his heart pounding in his ears. The baby in Sophie's arms stirred and whimpered softly, and that little sound seemed to jolt him out of his dream. "How is that even possible?" Richard asked in a scarcely audible voice. His thoughts were racing with questions. It was as if Emily's memory had failed him, as if the woman he had been mourning for almost 20 years had been someone else. He did not know for sure, but he did know one thing. Sophie accepted her statements as true. "I realize it's a lot to take in."
Sophie's voice was kind but firm.
"To be completely honest with you, I have spent my entire life trying to comprehend. Emily was the name of my mother." Richard felt his heart tighten. Why didn't she let me know? He nearly muttered to himself. It was unbearable to think Emily had kept something vital from him. For so many restless nights, he had wondered what they may have shared. If only things had gone differently. Now, those what-ifs seemed to carry an entirely different, painful meaning. Sophie gave a gentle shake of her head, sympathy gleaming in her eyes. "I'm not sure why she chose not to tell you about it. I never got the chance to ask her. She passed away while I was still a fetus." Richard tried to focus, but his mind was racing. There must be more to the story. Someone mentioned you. If Emily was your mother, then why did I not know about you? Sophie shuffled nervously, looking down at the floor as if the information was too much to take in. After her death, I was turned over to another household. I was not aware of my biological parents when I was growing up. Up until recently, all I had was a name and some vague information that I could piece together. I didn't know where to start looking for you. Richard had heart pain up until a few months prior. He had assumed all his life that he knew everything there was to know about Emily, so he was taken aback to discover that there were more dimensions to her life. You came here for clarification because he hadn't even read. Sophie nodded. Yes, in fact, I wanted to know who she was. I wanted to know why Mom had kept me in the dark and when I would find out where she was buried. I knew I had to come. Richard's gaze fell onto the tombstone, displaying his late wife's name etched in a stern, icy stone. He'd visited Emily's grave regularly for so long, had conversations with her, and tried to accept her loss. But that calm felt broken now that Sophie and the baby were here, and everything about him changed, including his memories, his understanding of Emily, and his anguish. He took a deep breath as his mind searched in vain for something solid to cling to throughout this storm of emotions surrounding the kid. Pointing to the child in Sophie's arms, Richard mumbled, "Is this my granddaughter?" His voice trembling a little. Sophie turned to look at the baby and smiled gently, calming herself down. "Yes," she whispered softly. "His name is Daniel." Richard stared at the baby, who looked tiny and fragile. His heart pounded with a combination of surprise, confusion, and something else he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope Daniel acted as a conduit between Emily and the life they may have had together, a life that had been concealed from him for a while, but that he could now embrace. Everything threatened to overwhelm Richard, and he felt its weight. He had spent years mourning Emily's lost existence and living in the past. From this position, he saw that life had not completely disappeared. He was being given the chance to reclaim a little of what had quietly continued without him. Still, there was betrayal. How could Emily have kept this from him? How in the world could she have made such a significant decision and told him she was pregnant? "I may not fully understand," said Richard. Finally, in a raspy voice, he asked, "Why would she hide you from me? Why would she put up with this on her own?" Sophie's countenance softened, yet there was still sadness in her eyes. "I don't know all the details, but I'm assuming she believed you wouldn't want the responsibility of raising a child or that you were too busy managing your business to be a father." "Richard, I've never met him. I hope I succeeded." She should have given me a choice, but Richard shook his head, feeling the weight of her words bearing down on him. "Please let me make the final decision." Sophie nodded. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought she was keeping you safe, or maybe she didn't know how to tell you. Richard was torn between feeling betrayed and thinking Emily had hidden SOP in an effort to defend herself. He had always believed Emily trusted him and that everything else was on an equal footing. There were parts of her that he had not yet gotten to know he was beginning to realize. Once again, Richard felt a strange connection form between himself and Sophie, and between her and the life he never knew existed and the opportunities he had wasted. However, that could be retracted now. "What do you want from me?" Richard asked in a low voice that hardly made it above a whisper. Sophie hesitated, then looked him in the eye. "I don't need anything from you. I just want to know where I'm from, and I think you should know the truth about your wife." Richard, who had been unaware of Emily's true nature for so long, at last nodded in agreement with her comments. He didn't know what was ahead, but one thing was for sure. His life had suddenly changed irrevocably. The way things were going, there was no going back, and maybe that was a good thing. Richard just stood there in silence, unable to believe what Sophie had just told him. For years, Emily, his daughter, lived a life he had never known and was kept a secret from him. The betrayal was painful, but it was also flavored with uncertainty, guilt, and a new responsibility he hadn't expected. Here he was, facing him, Sophie and the baby she held in her arms, living proof of a past he had been kept from knowing. "I have no idea who you are." When Richard finally spoke, his voice grew quieter and his sharp anger waned. "Emily didn't tell me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me?" A glint of empathy appeared in Sophie's eyes. "Why she did what she did is beyond me." "Richard." The same question is one I ask myself all the time, but I never get an answer. All I know is that she made that choice, and it affects the two of us, for whatever reason. Richard took a deep breath as his thoughts raced. Emily had never been one for the spotlight. They had had several arguments over how private she was, even with him. But this was kept a secret to a greater degree than he could have imagined. "What information about her do you know? What is the motivation behind her behavior?" With a hesitant tone that suggested he was afraid of the answer, Richard asked. Sophie sighed and looked down at the kid in her arms. "I'm interested in learning more. The people who raised me also didn't know anything about her. I have no doubt that she loved you. I've been attempting to put together what happened over the past few months, but there are a lot of gaps in the story." Richard's eyes widened at that. "Even if she didn't always tell you what was going on, it was always clear that you were important to her." Sophie shook her head gently and said, "She told you that no, but I've seen it in everything I've found about her, the way she lived her life, the way she talked about you to people." Gritting his teeth, Richard looked both irritated and dejected. Since Emily's death, he had been finding it difficult to accept that they would never have the future they had envisaged. Till this discovery, though, he believed his past wounds had healed. He was grieving more than just the death of his wife. He was mourning the life that he had never experienced and the daughter he had never had the chance to raise. "And you, Richard?" asked in a tense tone. "Why did you decide to find me right now?" The steadfast steadiness with which Sophie met his eyes astounded him. "I had no idea Emily was my mother until a few months ago. I had only a name and an unclear adoption story till then." moment I realized the truth. I realized that I had to come here to find out more about my history and identity. Moreover, to be truthful, I had no idea what I was going to find. Richard was struggling to breathe. Sophie had to carry with him the weight of a past she was unable to access, and he could see it in her eyes. He glanced at the baby that was now sound asleep in Sophie's arms. Richard found it almost incredible how little the child's chest moved. Even though it had been kept a secret from him for all these years, the life he had experienced with Emily had continued via his grandson, said Daniel Sophie. Daniel is his name, and it feels like someone is reading his thoughts. Richard repeated silently, looking at Daniel the baby with melting eyes. The sound of the name was strange on his tongue, but Richard hadn't expected it to feel so anchored. He had felt as though he was living life without purpose or direction. But now that he was here with Sophie and Daniel, something was shifting within him. I had no requests in mind when I arrived here. All I needed to know was the truth, and Sophie continued to push Richard out of his mind with her words. I don't expect you to be involved in Daniel's or my lives. It's important for me to know where I come from, and I now do. Richard stared at her, a flash of emotion coursing through him. He knew he had to treat this seriously, even though he wasn't sure what Sophie wanted from him. He could not take his eyes off her. You are my offspring. It was odd and out of character for Richard to say the words. Never in this very situation, standing in front of his wife's grave at a cemetery, had he imagined himself saying such words. That's why Daniel is now my grandchild. Sophie regarded him warily, unsure of his intended words. I have dedicated my entire life to developing something. Richard continued, his voice quiet yet resolute, but to no avail. Not in the wake of Emily's passing. Justin, even though it seems like I'm at a loss for what to do, I might still be able to make that right. Maybe I can still aspire to be something more than a businessman. Sophie blinked, looking surprised and suspicious at the same time. By what do you mean? I'll say it if it's okay with you. I don't want to miss anything more than what I've already missed, Richard said with a slight crack in his voice. I want to be a part of your life. Sophie stared at him, inscrutable, for a considerable amount of time. In her eyes, Richard saw her hesitancy and dread of disclosing too much to an unknown person. But there was also a flicker of optimism, the notion that maybe, just maybe, this might be the beginning of something new. I don't know if it will be easy, stated Sophie. Finally, her voice grew soft. Richard concurred, stating, There's a lot we don't know about each other. I understand, but let me try if you're willing. Sophie looked down at Daniel and then turned to face Richard. She said, Okay, we could give it a shot. For the first time in years, Richard had a small flicker of warmth in his chest. That was all he needed to feel hopeful that maybe, despite everything that had happened to him, there was still something to hold on to. After discovering that Emily had been hiding something, Richard's head was a-fluttering with emotions that day as he left the cemetery. He kept thinking about Sophie and Daniel as this distance from him tore at him. His once orderly and regular existence seems to have completely collapsed in a couple of hours. The city was buzzing with all of its usual intensity, but Richard moved through it as if he were on autopilot. The meeting with Sophie left him trembling all over, casting doubt on everything he had previously taken to be true about his upbringing. Given that Sophie was his daughter and Daniel was his grandchild, he was obliged to confront the strange sense of duty he suddenly felt, despite his deep desire to be angry with Emily for betraying him. That was too important to overlook. It was raining again when Richard got back to his apartment. He stood looking out at the falling city in the dimly lit area. His thoughts returned to Emily. She giggled as she thought back to the way she had looked at him in the fantasies they had shared before everything broke apart. Years passed while he tried to preserve her memory to ease his loss. Still, after Sophie's confession, Richard started to wonder if he had ever really known Emily at all. Why had she kept this from him? How was it possible for her to know? During the final months of her life, he was plagued by unanswered questions that would not go away. He didn't think he would ever find it. Richard walked to his desk and took out some old photos, letters, and small items that were meaningful to him and Emily, as well as other souvenirs from their time together. He took up an old photo of them taken during their courtship. That Emily and the person who had kept something so deeply altering from him, back when everything had seemed so full of promise and they seemed so happy and in love, he could not bring himself to reconcile. Drawing open the desk drawer, Richard pulled out a worn-out notebook. He'd been missing it for years. It was Emily's journal, kept sporadically during their marriage. He found it after she died, but he was worried reading it would make him feel much more grieving. However, it appeared to be his sole opportunity to comprehend what had transpired. Drawing in a deep breath, Richard opened the journal. He'd gotten a lot of notes and letters over the years, and he recognized the handwriting, which was an exquisite script. As he paged through her observations on routine activities, dinners with her, and travels they'd taken, nothing really drew his attention. He was searching for something, anything that would explain to him why she had hidden Sophie from him and then buried her toward the back of the notebook. He found it. Scanning the entry, which was dated only a few months before Emily's death, Richard's heart raced. "I am at a loss for what to do. It's unbelievable that I let this happen at this particular moment. After an extended length of time, Richard would never understand. I cannot be the one to divert his focus from the company and our future plans. He is concentrating hard on it. He deserves more credit than I can give. I wish I could tell him, even though I know it would ruin him. I don't want him to perceive me in this way. I can't tell him that." Richard's chest tightened as he read the lines. She had been afraid of his possible response, as well as the possible repercussions of her pregnancy on their lives. But why hadn't she trusted him? Why did she think he wouldn't want to take part in it? It seemed like he had taken a hit to the stomach. Emily hadn't kept it a secret because she thought it would help Sop, and she didn't want him to know. She'd been trying to protect him, in her own way, from the burden of raising a child at a time when their lives were already strained. Richard sat back in his chair, disgusted by the whole incident. It wasn't betrayal for Emily to have kept Sophie from him. She tried to shield him from her pain, but she was afraid of his response and how it might change their lives. But those decisions are now having an impact. It took Daniel Richard a long time to realize he was a grandfather. Richard had been denied the chance to be a part of Sophie's life, and she had grown up not knowing her father. He closed the journal, his mind whirling. What had happened could not be undone, nor could Emily's choices be undone. Still, there was hope for the future. Sophie had turned to him more than ever for guidance. Richard knew he could not turn his back on her. Hardening, he raised his determination. The only thing he could still do was be there for Sophie and Daniel. He had lost too much time already, and he was not going to lose any more. The next morning, Richard decided that he needed to contact Sophie. He wanted to honor the promise he made to her now more than ever. His understanding of how it would work was unclear, but he was willing to navigate their complex emotions. He grabbed the phone and dialed the number Sophie had given him. His heart raced as he waited for her to answer, not knowing what he would say when she did. After a few rings, Sophie's voice eventually came through the line. "Hi, strong but kind. Sophie." Richard's unease became apparent as soon as he started talking. He sensed that it was me. "Richard, now that I've given it some thought, I think we should talk." There was stillness on the other end, so Richard held his breath, unsure of her reaction. Finally, Sophie made a statement. "Indeed, I think we do." Richard relaxed a little, letting go of the constriction in his chest. It was nothing but a start, and that was more than enough for now. Richard and Sophie met again in a quiet corner of a small cafe, far from the bustling streets of the city center. He'd chosen a discreet yet neutral setting on purpose. A location where they could talk without being overly constrained by the past. He was early, and he nervously fiddled with the collar of his shirt as he sat down at the table to wait for her. His thoughts were still whirling from what he had read in Emily's notebook. It had helped him understand her better, but it had also made him feel even more hurt that he couldn't ask her directly. The reasoning behind her choices. Richard looked up as Sophie carried her into Café Daniel. She brushed her face as soon as she spotted him. calm but cautious. She moved in a tight way, as if she were uncertain about the outcome. She shifted Daniel around in her arms, trying to soothe his distress, then turned back to Richard after softly sitting down in the chair across from him and murmuring, "Hello. I am grateful that you visited me." Squeezing nervously in his throat, Richard gave a nod. He said something a little harsher than he intended to, of course. Daniel was staring up at him with wide eyes, silently and curiously, when he gazed down at him. "What state is he in?" Sophie gave the infant's head a gentle pat. "He's doing well and growing swiftly." For a brief period, they remained mute, as neither of them knew how to start the conversation that was about to happen. Richard cleared his throat, deciding it would be best to just dive right in. "I've thought a lot about what you told me." Richard began to talk softly, and something caught my attention. "It helps to explain Emily's choice to keep you a secret from me." Her eyebrow went up, clearly intrigued but cautious. "What did you manage to find out?" Richard paused for a moment before reaching inside his jacket to get Emily's journal. He slipped it across the table towards Sophie. "This is what I found out. It's her yearbook from her final year of life. She wrote about her fears and her reasons for keeping you a secret." Sophie did not try to open the journal. Instead, she just stared at it, her fingers delicately caressing the surface. She didn't say it out, but it's clear that she was terrified of my reaction as well as how having a child may impact our lives. Richard nodded. "She wrote about me. She thought she was protecting me by keeping things from me." Sophie's hand momentarily touched the journal, and then she removed it, her face softening. Richard had never heard her voice sound awful until she remarked, "I've wondered why she didn't want me my entire life." "It's difficult to hear that. She was trying to keep you safe too, not just me." Richard leaned forward and met her gaze. "Not that she wasn't interested in you. Sophie, I see now that she was overworked. Even though she was unable to handle anything, it doesn't mean she didn't love you. Most likely, she was just lost." Sophie took a long breath, and her shoulders lowered slightly. "It's hard to say now, but I guess I always felt that I would have some kind of closure if I knew why my mother gave up on me." Richard nodded. "I've discovered I realize it's not simple, that time travel is not possible. You are limited to making decisions in the present moment." There was a pause, and Richard could see the spectrum of emotions on Sophie's face: relief, doubt, and hopelessness. Hearing those remarks about her mother made her feel as though a portion of the weight she had been carrying for so long had been lifted. "I am at a loss for what to do." Taking everything into account, Sophie claimed she had trouble speaking louder than a whisper. "Now that I've spent so much time getting angry with her and you, I don't know how to feel." Richard's heart ached from the genuine tenderness in her remarks. Even though he understood there were no simple solutions, he still wanted to offer anything that would help. They were both trying to navigate new territory while trying to make sense of the turmoil that had been left behind. "I recognize." Silently, Richard spoke the words. "I mean, I've been angry too, but maybe we could work through this together." Sophie stared at him, hoping to find solace or assurance in his eyes. "You really want to be in my life after everything I've done," said Richard. "I've already lost a lot of time without stopping to ponder." "Sophie, I'm over wanting to fall short. If you're willing to assume some risk in this, I'm the same way." There was a moment of silence, and Sophie nodded softly. "I need more time, but I'll give it a try." "Richard." There's a lot to take in. Richard reached across the table and wrapped his fingers around hers, barely making contact. "I'm sure we'll start off gently. There isn't a rush." Sophie glanced at Daniel before turning back to Richard, who was fast asleep in her arms. "You know, he doesn't have a grandfather," she said softly, her mouth slightly smiling. Richard's heart began to race. He remarked in a passionate voice, "I'd like to change that." Sophie wiped a tear from her face and agreed. That would probably be enjoyable to Daniel as well. For the first time, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. Even though it was fragile, he had believed for so long that he had no chance of survival when Emily passed away. But while he and Sophie sat here, he realized that this was still a cause worth fighting for. They sat quietly for a short while, the weight of their common past hanging over them. But there was also something new there, an uncomfortable connection, a chance to rebuild what had been shattered. While they were leaving the coffee shop, Richard walked along Sophie, enjoying the warmth of the sun's first ever appearance that day through the clouds. Richard contemplated the possibility of a small but insignificant improvement for the first time in years. In the days that followed their encounter in the cafe, there was a cautious hope. Richard and Sophie always seemed hesitant to say or do something that would break their fragile bond as their time together grew. Even though it was hard for him to look at Sophie every day, Richard understood that she needed her space and was eager to show her that he meant business in her life. As much as he wanted to embrace this new chapter, the knowledge of how much he had missed and how much time had passed kept him engrossed in the past. His thoughts were constantly returning to Emily and the choices she had made. After all the years he had spent idealizing and exalting her, it was difficult to reconcile the picture of the woman he had loved with the one who had kept such a profoundly transforming secret from him. One evening after a really difficult day, Richard was sitting in his living room, enjoying a tumbler of whiskey. He wanted to be close to Sophie after being apart from her for a few days, but he was also aware of her restrictions. He was unsure of how to walk carefully in this precarious situation. He felt like he was giving up on another chance, even though he knew that pushing too hard might push her away. The buzzing sound of his phone on the table next to him jolted him out of his daydream. I had received an SMS from Sophie. Could we talk about this tomorrow? I would like you to hear this message. Richard's heart skipped a beat. The message was simple, yet it was clear how important it was. After quickly typing back to accept her invitation to meet, he let his mind roam, full of possibilities. Does she have anything to tell him? Was it something Daniel was causing, or was Emily the cause? Something new that would put things into better context for him. The next morning, they met at a park near Sophie's apartment. Richard approached Daniel, who was curled up with Sophie in his stroller, and noticed the tension in her posture. When she noticed him, her eyes narrowed and she smiled. "Hi there." She spoke quietly but tensely, thanking me for the meeting. "Of course," Richard answered, growing more concerned about what was going on. Sophie beckoned for them to sit on a nearby bench as they took a seat with their backs to the lake. The serene lake reflected the glistening blue sky overhead, yet the atmosphere between them was anything but peaceful. Richard could see that Sophie had a lot of weight behind her remarks. "I've been thinking about it a lot." With her hands tucked into her lap, Sophie began to squirm and chatter about everything and everyone, including Daniel, my parents, you, and something I still hadn't told you. Richard's heart pounded violently within him. He tried to keep his look neutral, but he could feel his nerves getting more tense. "You can tell me anything you want to. Sophie. Whatever the situation, we'll work it out." Sophie nodded without meeting his gaze. Instead, she stared out at the lake, her speech barely audible above a whisper. "I've always wondered why my mother decided not to tell you about me. Maybe she was terrified of your reaction, or maybe she just didn't want to bother you," I thought to myself. "But I have found something that might assist in clarifying it." Richard was struggling to breathe. "What did you manage to find out?" There was a moment of silence before Sophie delved inside her bag and removed a small piece of folded paper. Richard observed the mixture of anguish and dread in her eyes when she finally met his and handed it to him. Richard slowly unfolded the paper with shaky hands. It was an old letter, the kind with frayed edges and somewhat faded ink from years of wear and tear. The handwriting was unmistakable. Heart-pounding, he began to read Emily's book. As the meaning of the words became apparent, "Richard, although I doubt you'll read it, I had to write it. I've been hiding something from you that I doubt I'll ever come clean about. I'm scared because I'm pregnant. You've always expressed a desire for no children, and I've respected that. However, in light of this news, I am at a loss for what to do. In order to keep you, I don't want to give you more than you requested. I'm choosing to withhold this from you because I love you, not because I don't care. I'm hoping you'll overlook this one day." When Richard had done reading, his hand shook. His mind was unable to comprehend the words. He just stared at the letter. Because of something he had said years before they were even married, Emily believed he had wanted her to keep the pregnancy a secret, even though she knew she was pregnant. "I'm not sure I understand." Richard spoke a barely heard murmur. "I kept my desire for children a secret from her. Though I may have said it casually when we were younger, I never meant it. I assumed that, collectively, we would work it out." Sophie gave him a sympathetic glance as she stared at him. "Richard, I believe she was just afraid. Don't lose you. She thought this was the only way to keep you." With a shake of his head, Richard felt the weight of the discovery sink in. After all these years, he had been under the impression that he and Emily had fully understood one another. However, he suddenly saw that they had been living with disparate expectations and anxieties, and that those unsaid things had ripped them apart in ways he could never have predicted. "I was ignorant." With a broken voice, Richard spoke. "I would have supported her if I had known. I would have provided support to you." Sophie put a delicate yet reassuring hand on his arm. "I know, and perhaps she did too, deep down, but she made the decision that, at the moment, seemed right. And here we are at this moment." Tears filled Richard's eyes, and he was speechless for a while. It was almost too much to face the anguish of what had been lost and what could have been. However, Sophie was correct. The past was unchangeable. They had no choice but to proceed. He turned to face Sophie, the daughter he had never met, and then turned to face Daniel, the grandson he had welcomed into his life with such unexpectedness that "I will not waste words on him now," said Richard. At last, his tone unwavering, even with tears in his eyes. "I wish to have a role in your life, Sophie. Daniel deserves my presence. It doesn't matter how difficult it is. We'll work things out." Sophie nodded slowly, grinning despite her own tears. "That's what I also want." For a brief while, they sat in silence, the past still weighing heavily on them, but with hope for the future beginning to slowly emerge. It would not be simple. There was still a ton of questions and things to consider. However, this is the first time. Richard felt like they were ready to collaborate. Richard's days after their park talk passed slowly as he continued thinking about the letter Sophie had shown him. Emily's words troubled him. She had made a choice based on a fear that he was unaware even existed, and that fear had permanently altered the trajectory of their lives. Richard had always believed that he was in charge of his life, decisions, and feelings. However, this instance, he was left reeling from the enormity of it all, as hidden aspirations and misinterpreted anxieties came to bear. One late night, Richard found himself sipping a drink in his study while he gazed at Emily's journal. The quiet in the chamber was strangely complemented by the slight hum of the metropolis outside, according to the letter Sophie had given him. He was caught between the past and the present, not knowing how to make sense of the life he had once known and the now known truth that he had desired children. He recalled considering it, seeing a scenario in which he and Emily would one day start a family. However, life had interfered with his work, their travels and their hectic lives with their unlimited options. They'd always promised to talk about children later, but that time had never arrived. The true tragedy, though, was realizing that his casual remarks from years prior had been sufficient to motivate Emily to maintain such a profoundly transformative secret. Richard was young and had not long been married, so he couldn't even recall the exact details of their talk, though he had likely mentioned something about not wanting children straight away. He never meant it, and maybe never will. He'd finally decided that one day, but that day, they would have a proper discussion about it. Gazing down at the papers in front of him, Richard inhaled deeply. He was at a loss for how to feel about Emily. Something more complicated was taking the place of the pain he had carried for so long, a blend of love, remorse, and wrath. He cherished her still. He would always have, but right now that love was mixed up with a profound sense of loss, not only for her, but also for the life they could have had together and the family they could have had. Then there was the daughter he had never met, Sophie. The child Emily had concealed from him, trying to save him a burden he would have gladly taken on. Richard couldn't close the gap, but he wanted to be there for her to make up for lost time. Despite being related through blood, their years of silence and secrets kept them apart as strangers. As eager as he was to go into this new position, father, he knew it was not that easy. Sophie lived a unique existence filled with her own experiences and suffering. He could hardly expect to walk in and instantly fill a hole that had been there for years. He needed to gain her trust and establish his position in her life, and such things took time to accomplish. Richard was startled out of his reverie when he heard the buzz of his desk phone. It was Sophie's message. "Tomorrow, are you free? Would you be interested in joining us for Daniel's afternoon doctor's appointment?" No demands were made. "I just assumed you would want to attend." Richard's heart was heavy with hope and fear as he continued to stare at the screen. Sophie extended her hand. She was giving him an opportunity to start a new journey with Daniel by allowing him to be a part of her life. Without giving it too much thought, he hastily typed, "I'd love to come." "Tell me the time, please." He felt a wave of relief as soon as he clicked send. Though it wasn't much, it was a beginning. He didn't know how this new job would feel or what to expect. For the family he had lost and the one he still had a chance to be a part of, he was willing to try for Sophie for Daniel, though. The following day, Sophie and Richard met outside the pediatrician's office. She stood close to the door. Daniel appeared to be both relieved and anxious to see him, wrapped up in his stroller. When Richard approached them, he couldn't help but smile. For an instant, Daniel's large eyes peered up at him from beneath his hat. Richard's doubts vanished completely. "Hi there." Naturally, Sophie expressed her gratitude for arriving in a gentle yet kind voice. In response, Richard kneeled down to examine Daniel more closely. "How is the small man doing?" Richard asked. "He's not particularly finicky, just a little bit." While adjusting Daniel's blanket, Sophie managed a small smile. "I reasoned that you could come here and get to know him a little better." Her comments warmed Richard's heart. She didn't find it simple to give this. Although Sophie had valid reasons for her walls to be up, he appreciated that she was making an effort, which was more than he could have asked for. Together, they entered the office and struck up a conversation. They were holding out for Daniel's appointment. Richard was observing Sophie when he noticed how she talked to her son, how sensitive her voice sounded, and how she appeared to know what he needed. It was upsetting as well as joyful. Feeling that he should have been in her life from the start, he couldn't help but imagine what it would have been like if he had been there for her. But thinking about the past was pointless. What mattered was that he was here now. Although Richard's doctor's appointment was simple, just a short checkup, it felt significant to him. He understood that he had been missing out on these moments his entire life, the ordinary, daily moments of being a father, of seeing a child develop and discover that their existence wasn't flashy or magnificent, but it was real as he sat next to Sophie and watched the doctor weigh and measure Daniel. Without realizing it, he had been longing for this kind of connection. Once their appointment ended, they strolled back outside in the cool afternoon breeze. Richard felt a knot form in his throat as he turned to face Sophie. "Thank you very much." His tone was low yet earnest as he said, "You're welcome for allowing me to be a part of this," Sophie said as she softened her gaze on him. "I want you involved in it. Though I'm sure it won't be simple, I believe we can work it out." Feeling the weight of her words, Richard nodded. As they stood there watching the sun set behind the metropolitan skyline, they realized they were on the same page, cautious yet hopeful, both eager to take the necessary measures to establish something together. Richard gave himself permission to think that perhaps, in spite of everything, there was still time for healing, for atonement, and for him to fulfill his lifelong dreams of being a father and grandfather. Days became weeks as time went on. Inside Richard, cautious optimism started to take root. He had begun to spend more time with Sophie and Daniel, and he had noticed a strange yet reassuring rhythm in their interactions. Slowly but surely, the discomfort of their new relationship was starting to wear off and be replaced with a tenuous but real bond. Richard had made it plain that he was totally dedicated to being a part of their life, while letting Sophie choose the pace and being cautious not to overdo it. In the afternoon, for the first time, Sophie invited Richard to her flat. Richard entered the modest but warmly decorated space and could tell Sophie had taken considerable effort to make it her and Daniel's home. The floor of the living room was covered in toys, and the couch was covered in a cozy blanket. There was a subtle aroma of freshly made coffee and baby lotion throughout the flat. "Ensure your comfort." As Sophie removed Daniel from his pram, she gestured to the couch. Richard nodded and said, "I'll get us some coffee," taking a seat and surveying the space. He was proud of Sophie for the life she had created for herself, but he also felt a tremendous deal of remorse that he hadn't been present to see any of it. No matter how hard he tried to move on, the sense of loss he had suffered would never go away. Richard's eyes strayed to a tiny picture frame on the bookcase as Sophie vanished into the kitchen. It was a photo of Sophie cuddling Daniel, their happy, joyful eyes beaming at the camera. Simple as it was, the image had a profound effect on Richard. It dawned on him that he was seeing a family he had never met. He was a family man. It was only now that he started to get it. A few moments later, Sophie came back with 2 coffee mugs. She adjusted Daniel on her lap, gave one to Richard, and took a seat across from him. With sweet coos, the baby's plump hands reached for his mother's hair. Sophie broke the cozy silence with a statement. "I've been thinking a lot lately about Mom and all of us, and I believe you should know something else as well." Richard's pulse began to quicken as he looked up from his coffee. Even though he was accustomed to the notion that new information about Emily's history would always surface, it didn't make the revelations any more bearable. "What's that?" he questioned thoughtfully. With her fingers playing with Daniel's little palm, Sophie inhaled deeply. "Once we discussed Mom and the reasons behind her hiding me from you, I began to look a little more closely. I discovered something that satisfied my desire to learn more about her life and the reasons behind the decisions she made. It brings about adjustments." Placing his drink down on the coffee table, Richard scowled. "By what do you mean?" After a brief moment of hesitation, Sophie got up and moved toward the bookshelves. She returned to the couch, laid it between them, and took out a small package that Richard had missed. This. Silently, Sophie stated, "It was in my mother's belongings. Though it's not from her, it's still a letter. I believe you knew someone else who sent it." Sophie gave Richard the letter, and Richard felt his stomach knot. Slowly unfolding it, he scanned the penmanship, which he knew well. Richard's heart stopped as he saw the signature at the bottom, even though it was addressed to Emily. Not just any James D., but James Porter, an old friend of Richard's from his youth, was the source of the information. Over the years, the two had lost contact, but before Richard and Emily were married, they were close. Richard felt his blood turn cold as he read the letter. "Emily, I need to write everything down for my mental health, but I'm not sure I'll ever have the courage to send it to you. Even though we've kept this a secret for so long, it's bothering me more than before. I can't bear to keep acting like Richard doesn't know what occurred between us. You don't have to tell him, I promise. I need you to know that even though I understand how difficult things might be, I never stop thinking about you and our past. If circumstances were different, although I know you made your decision, I would have battled harder for you. I just want you to be happy, even without me." When James Richard finished reading, his hands began to shake. Gazing at the letter, his thoughts raced over James and Emily's potential relationship. Was there something going on between them that he was unaware of? Sophie gave him a close look while maintaining a sympathetic demeanor. She murmured softly, "I didn't want to tell you straight immediately. Although I wasn't sure how you would react, I felt that you should know." The realization came over Richard like a tidal wave, and he was at a loss for words as his heart thumped in his chest. Despite the fact that Richard had known James for years, trusted him, and regarded him as a friend, this letter raised whole new possibilities that Richard had not even considered. "What are you saying?" Richard started to tremble. "Are you saying that James and Emily?" Sophie nodded gradually, and her eyes lit up with comprehension. "I'm not up to date on everything, though I'm not sure when it occurred or how long it lasted. Indeed, they appear to have been involved." Eventually, it seemed as though Richard's foundation had been lifted off him. His mind racing, he got up and started pacing the little living room. always felt like he and Emily had something special and indestructible. However, after receiving this letter, everything was questioned. Had Emily truly loved James? Would she have concealed this information as well, fearing that Richard would leave her, or was there something more going on that Richard was unaware of the entire time? "This is unbelievable." Richard's voice was hardly audible above a whisper. "I'm not sure what to think at all." Sophie got to her feet and approached him, putting her hand on his arm. "I understand how difficult this is. Richard, I assure you. Mom never intended to hurt you, but I know I've been having trouble with it. I believe she was just afraid, just as she was in every other situation." Richard forced a deep swallow as a mixture of rage and grief welled up inside of him. It seems as though the life he had spent years mourning Emily and the life they had lost had been based on secrets and lies he had never been told. "How do we handle this?" With a broken voice, Richard inquired, "From here, how do we proceed?" Sophie sighed, the same uncertainty visible in her eyes. Richard experienced, "I'm not certain. I wish I had the answers, but I believe that understanding everything and figuring out what it all means will simply take time." With his thoughts still racing, Richard nodded slowly. He was unsure of how to proceed or make sense of Emily's connection with James in light of his love for her. Despite everything they had gone through, he was certain that he would not lose Sophie. "I wish to keep you close." Silently, Richard spoke the words. His voice was emotional. "Whatever transpires, whatever we learn, I don't want anything to get in the way of our relationship." Sophie gave him a soft-eyed glance. "I'm not going to leave you. Richard, let's work together on this." Richard inhaled deeply, considering the significance of her remarks. It wasn't the response he wanted, but it was enough. It sufficed. Over the next 3 days, Richard was preoccupied by the revelation of James Porter. He made an effort to understand it, but despite his best efforts, the solutions eluded him. His thoughts drifted back to earlier times and events in his life, and Emily and James looked for hints that could have revealed this secret. But was there any particular instance that jumped out, or any suspicion that had ever occurred to him? How was it that he missed it? Unable to sleep, Richard found himself pacing his apartment deep into the night. He couldn't get the note Sophie had found off his thoughts. It brought up a lot of issues. If Emily had been in love with James, was it a transient relationship or something more committed? And why had James never been honest with him? Greater than all of it, Richard had a sickening sense of betrayal. He had confidence in both of them. James is one of his closest friends and Emily is his wife. However, this instance, that trust seemed to be gone and was replaced with a persistent, nagging distrust. The morning after, Richard took a stand. He was in need of clarification. He could not bear the uncertainty any longer. He eventually located James's contact details after some searching. They hadn't communicated for years, not since their separation following Emily's passing. Richard, though, could not let go of this. He needed to face him. Richard picked up the phone, his heart thumping hard in his chest. It rang many times until a familiar voice picked up. "Hello there." Though James's voice sounded more aged and worn than Richard had remembered, it was unmistakably James. "It's Richard Lawson," Richard stated in a strained voice. Richard heard the hesitation in James's voice when he finally spoke after a pause on the other end of the call. "Richard, a very long time has passed." Though he was feeling more and more tense, Richard nodded and said, "I need to talk to you about Emily." One more pause. Emily James sounded cautious, almost like he knew what was going to happen. "And her?" "I came across a letter." Quite simply, Richard brought up a letter he'd sent to her about something that happened to the two of you. "I think you understand what I mean." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Richard could feel the weight of the unspoken truth hanging between them. When James finally answered, it was in a tone that was almost dejected. "I was unaware that you would ever come to know." Richard's mouth tensed as the realization hit him. "Are you and Emily having an extramarital affair, James? Or was it one time?" James let out a long, heavy sigh. That was not the reality. Richard, it wasn't an affair. It was challenging. Richard grew upset and perplexed. That's all you have to say. I believed in you. James, you were my friend. Yes, I am conscious of it. James gave a remorseful response. Richard, neither Emily nor I ever meant to hurt you. What had happened to us? It was a mistake, even though it wasn't what you had assumed. Richard tightened his grip on the phone. Please tell me what it was, since it seems like you two have been withholding something really significant from me. James hesitated again, and when he did say anything, it was in a quiet, almost melancholy tone. Emily and you didn't get serious until much later. Our short-lived partnership ended. Emily chose you. Richard, she had a crush on you. What had happened to us? It ended long before you two got married. Richard's heart pounded violently within him. It was difficult to comprehend the betrayal even after it was over. Why didn't either of you do it? Tell me. I'm not certain. James nodded. At first, it didn't seem to matter. It was some time ago, and we both continued. However, time went on. I guess we were both concerned about what would happen to your marriage. And later, after Emily's death, it was hard for me to tell you. I didn't want to cause you any more pain. Richard shook his head, barely concealing his disgust. You think it was best to keep things hidden from me. You'd think I wouldn't have wanted to know the truth. With remorse in his voice, James responded, I don't know, Richard. I thought I was behaving appropriately at the time. Still, looking back, maybe I should have told you. Richard's heart tightened. The rage and frustration that had been building inside of him since reading the letter was exploding. Nevertheless, the weight of all these secrets was wearing him down. Having to deal with all these lies was too much. I don't know what to say to you, said James Richard. Finally, he spoke with strain. I'm not sure how to process this. I understand, James responded mutely. I apologize. And I really do, Richard. Should I be allowed to make changes in the past? Indeed, I would. All I can do now, though, is apologize and really hope you will be able to overlook my actions. Forgiving. Richard wasn't convinced he could pull it off right now. He understood that holding on to his anger wouldn't help, even though the betrayal still seemed too fresh and raw. Richard was honest, saying, James, I'm not sure if I can forgive you. I appreciate your honesty, though. James remained silent for some time before speaking again. If you ever want to talk, I'm available. There's a lot to take in, but I'm here to answer your questions. Richard wasn't sure if he wanted to hear much more. It stung him enough as it was, and he wasn't sure whether he wanted to go into a pass anymore. But he knew that he needed time to process and heal. I need to write everything down for my mental health, but I'm not sure I'll ever have the courage to send it to you. Even though we've kept this a secret for so long, it's bothering me more than before. I can't bear to keep acting like Richard doesn't know what occurred between us. You don't have to tell him, I promise. I need you to know that even though I understand how difficult things might be, I never stopped thinking about you in our past. If circumstances were different, although I know you made your decision, I would have battled harder for you. I just want you to be happy, even without me. When James Richard finished reading, his hands began to shake. Gazing at the letter, his thoughts raced over James and Emily's potential relationship. Was there something going on between them that he was unaware of? Sophie gave him a close look while maintaining a sympathetic demeanor. She murmured softly, I didn't want to tell you straight immediately. Although I wasn't sure how you would react, I felt that you should know. The realization came over Richard like a tidal wave, and he was at a loss for words as his heart thumped in his chest. Despite the fact that Richard had known James for years, trusted him, and regarded him as a friend, this letter raised whole new possibilities that Richard had not even considered. What are you saying? Richard started to tremble. Are you saying that James and Emily? Sophie nodded gradually, and her eyes lit up with comprehension. I'm not up to date on everything, though I'm not sure when it occurred or how long it lasted. Indeed, they appear to have been involved. Eventually, it seemed as though Richard's foundation had been lifted off him. His mind racing, he got up and started pacing the little living room. Always felt like he and Emily had something special and indestructible. However, after receiving this letter, everything was questioned. Had Emily truly loved James? Would she have concealed this information as well, fearing that Richard would leave her, or was there something more going on that Richard was unaware of the entire time? This is unbelievable. Richard's voice was hardly audible above a whisper. I'm not sure what to think at all. Sophie got to her feet and approached him, putting her hand on his arm. I understand how difficult this is. Richard, I assure you. Mom never intended to hurt you, but I know I've been having trouble with it. I believe she was just afraid, just as she was in every other situation. Richard forced a deep swallow as a mixture of rage and grief welled up inside of him. It seems as though the life he had spent years mourning Emily and the life they had lost had been based on secrets and lies he had never been told. How do we handle this? With a broken voice, Richard inquired, From here, how do we proceed? Sophie sighed, the same uncertainty visible in her eyes. Richard experienced, I'm not certain. I wish I had the answers, but I believe that understanding everything and figuring out what it all means will simply take time. With his thoughts still racing, Richard nodded slowly. He was unsure of how to proceed or make sense of Emily's connection with James in light of his love for her. Despite everything they had gone through, he was certain that he would not lose Sophie. I wish to keep you close. Silently, Richard spoke the words. His voice was emotional. Whatever transpires, whatever we learn, I don't want anything to get in the way of our relationship. Sophie gave him a soft-eyed glance. I'm not going to leave you. Richard, let's work together on this. Richard inhaled deeply, considering the significance of her remarks. It wasn't the response he wanted, but it was enough. It sufficed. Over the next 3 days, Richard was preoccupied by the revelation of James Porter. He made an effort to understand it, but despite his best efforts, the solutions eluded him. His thoughts drifted back to earlier times and events in his life, and Emily and James looked for hints that could have revealed this secret. But was there any particular instance that jumped out, or any suspicion that had ever occurred to him? How was it that he missed it? Unable to sleep, Richard found himself pacing his apartment deep into the night. He couldn't get the note Sophie had found off his thoughts. It brought up a lot of issues. If Emily had been in love with James, was it a transient relationship or something more committed? And why had James never been honest with him? Greater than all of it, Richard had a sickening sense of betrayal. He had confidence in both of them. James is one of his closest friends and Emily is his wife. However, this instance, it has, in fact, but I don't want the past to control how the future unfolds. I want to focus on what we have right now being there for you, Sophie remarked with a smile. Her gratitude was shining in her eyes. That matters a tremendous deal to me. Richard. I think you're right, even though I know none of us have found this easy. Even if time travel is not possible for us, progress is still possible. Richard felt a surge of calmness. It wasn't that the pain was any less present. Even though he knew it would always be there just below the surface, it no longer felt like an insurmountable burden. He had found something more substantial, a goal. They continued to sit by the lake. Sophie shifted in her seat and spoke in a shy but upbeat manner. You know, I've also been thinking about Daniel. He's going to need a lot of people that love and care about him in his life. And I think you may have a big part in that if you want to. Richard felt his heart rush at her remarks. That's what I truly, truly desire. As he spoke, his voice was brimming with passion. I want to be part of your life and of his.
Sophie smiled, tears glistening in her eyes.
That's wonderful to hear, since I think having a grandfather would be really beneficial to him. The word surprised Richard, but in the greatest possible manner. Papa! It was a role he had never imagined for himself, not after all the years of solemnity and grief. However, this instance, It appeared to be the biggest part he could have ever had. For me, that would be an honor. Richard spoke, barely lifting his voice beyond a whisper. I'm willing to try, even though I'm not sure how skilled I'll be. Sophie placed her palm on Daniel's small foot and laughed softly. We are just able to try our hardest. They all sat there watching Daniel laugh at the ducks for the first time in a long time. Richard felt as though he was in his rightful place. Over the next 6 months, Richard's life continued to change in ways he could never have predicted. He became closer to Sophie, handling their complicated relationship with honesty and tolerance. There were still tough moments and unsolved questions, but they were still learning how to handle their common problems. Daniel's life began to revolve more around Richard as well. He found himself looking forward to his time with his grandson with wide-eyed wonder, whether it was spending time with him, taking him to the park, or just reading books to him. Richard felt a kind of delight he had never known he was capable of feeling through it all. Richard learned to release himself from the anger and bitterness that had previously consumed him. He came to terms with the fact that some things were better left in the past and that he would never fully understand Emily. What mattered now was the future, the life he was building with Sophie and Daniel, the family he was rediscovering. One evening, when Richard sat in his apartment and looked out over the metropolitan skyline, he realized just how much had changed. He was no longer the lonely person that had once defined him. It was replaced by a sense of connection and belonging he hadn't experienced in years. He still went to Emily's grave again and then, but the visits were different. They were less about complaining and more about reflection. The deep love he had for her will always be there in him. But he knew that in order to make room for the new life he was living with Sophie and Daniel, he had to let her go. The sun set over the city, casting a warm glow across the skyline. Richard felt a calm satisfaction settle over him. He'd grown to appreciate this life, despite not planning it years earlier. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that there was hope, however far, for the future.